All right, welcome back to All Day Live. Operation Metro Surge is ending. That's according to the Trump administration's border czar, Tom Homan. You heard him earlier here on All Day this morning. He held a press conference. And then Governor Tim Walz saying that he is in trust but verify mode. So I guess the question now is, what now? Axel Henry is the police chief in St. Paul. Thank you so much for being here today. We got some big news today. Your reaction to Tom Homan's announcement?
You know, obviously, I'm happy to see that this come to this point. I think that's a good sign if things are headed in the right direction. I also think it's a testament to the fact that, you know, it's important when we're dealing with these really challenging issues that the decision makers and the folks that have the responsibility, whether it's politicians or other leaders, are getting in rooms together and having conversations. And what we're seeing is that although the voices outside, you know, whether it's through First Amendment rights and those types of things are crucial to how our country operates, a lot of times some of the most important conversations are happening behind those closed doors, and then the people are coming to some real resolutions. And so I'm really optimistic that this is a good sign of that.
I want to get to that in detail because you were someone who early on was one of the first law enforcement officers to publicly say we need to start looking at explore options to cooperate. So we'll talk about that in a little while, but I really want to just step back and as we look at the last few months, break it down into almost different buckets here, starting with your department internally. What's the headspace right now for your officers, the people who work for St. Paul PD?
You know, I think they're amazing individuals and they're very resilient. But I think that this is going to provide some relief for them as well. You can imagine that if your husband or wife works on our department and you're going to work every day and there's always a chance that you're going to either have something happen in your jurisdiction that's going to be very controversial or you're going to be asked for mutual aid to go to another department. We've had to do that a number of times. We're a member of a lot of partnerships and coalitions with law enforcement where if their resources get taxed, we go to help them, and if vice versa, if we have an issue, they come and help us. And you know, that unknown is probably one of the scariest things that the officers have to deal with. And so when you're going to work every day and you're just not knowing what, I mean, the job is always unpredictable, but with these levels of you know, emotions around these issues, that can be very volatile. And you know, the officers wear that. They're members of these communities. We're all a member of the St. Paul community, and when they're struggling, we're feeling it. And we're not just feeling it at a protest or at an incident that occurs in our city that's related to immigration enforcement. We're feeling it when we're going into your living room, taking a report call about a burglary or dealing with a domestic. And so anything that we can do to bring that temperature back down and, you know, to get us all kind of back to more of a sense of normality is a good thing.
Your officers did have to respond fairly early on in this surge in some way, and I know there are cities that have separation ordinances. St. Paul is one of them, but there was some overlap. Was there misconception, do you think, on from the public's perspective on when local law enforcement was going to respond, and what's that been like to have your officers out there now, you know, eventually going in and having to arrest protesters?
Yeah, thankfully we haven't had to do that very much, so I'm very happy about that because that's just we don't ever want it to devolve to that position. I was speaking very early on in January and February to many community groups before anything had really jumped off about what the separation ordinance meant, what it didn't mean, and how we would show up as a police department. And we try to do that whenever we can early on because at that time, no one was angry about anything. It was all, you know, forecasted behavior. And so we try to get that information out there at a time when the emotions are lower so that when things get ramped up, what we're saying doesn't sound like an excuse or anything like that. And, you know, I think that was effective for a number of people, but obviously not for everybody. And, you know, I'm not happy to say that I was one of the people that predicted some of these things could play out this way if indeed we didn't find ways to come together earlier so that, you know, in St. Paul, our approach to fighting crime or anything else is always that prevention is the gold standard. You know, the never happened is always better than we went in and solved the crime. We'd rather just never have someone be a victim of a crime or have something happen. So, you know, it's just been something that we've been working at. But again, it's why I'm so happy to hear that maybe some traction has been made in regards to this, this Operation Metro Surge. A
lot of opinions, obviously, within the community about should St. Paul PD be involved at all? Also, I guess I'm really curious to hear what you've heard from people in these affected communities, because most people aren't going to, a lot of people are sheltering in place. They're afraid to go to work or school. And we haven't really heard those voices, but I know you have. What do you want us to know about that?
Well, you know, it's funny. I've been asked to do a lot of national news shows, and I've turned them down, and not the least of which, and not to be, you know, over complimentary to you, but I haven't been able to even come in to hear at the cadence that I wanted to. But one of my frustrations has been that, you know, I watch the national news, and you're seeing people from nowhere near here diagnosing what's happening here. And I think one of the things that I've seen very clearly come out is this idea that, you know, some of these businesses are suffering because all the folks that have immigration issues aren't going out right now, and that's what's driving down business. And that's not what's driving down business. What's driving down business is American citizens, residents, people with legal status are also so afraid that they're not going out. And I think, you know, that's been a struggle for us that are here on the ground dealing with folks every day, is that we're hearing the national story get told about what's happening here in Minnesota, and it doesn't reflect what we're seeing firsthand, and that has been frustrating. But it's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people have been so outspoken, and then why a lot of people like me have been working behind the scenes trying to, you know, create or set up conversations to really get, you know, upstream of this and say, how do we stop all these things from happening?
Yeah, so you mentioned that it was, I believe, January 20th, approximately 3 weeks ago, there was a press conference with you, Hennepin County Sheriff DeWanna Witt, Brooklyn Park Police Chief Mark Bruley were sort of leading it, and you had other leaders behind you from law enforcement. And I think that was, if I remember back, that was the point at which, at least I remembered, where I felt like law enforcement had come forward and said, you know, multiple things are kind of true here at the same time. And so I pulled a couple of things. You said, as a group, that you believe that the vast majority of the federal agents here are doing legit work that's legal. You also said there are blatant illegal tactics like racially profiling, including of off-duty law enforcement. But you believe it's small groups of federal agents who seem to have less supervision. That was the first time that, you know, I had heard that, and, you know, I'm in the media, and so I'm just curious, you know, the political theater here that happens, and based on your reaction, I'm curious how you feel about, you know, all of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I said it in this press conference. I said, you know, when I bring this up, there are going to be some people that hear what I say, and they're going to say, oh, you only care about this because it's involving your off-duty officers. And then the other side of the group's going to say, well, you're being critical of what the federal government's doing, so you want rapists to be out on the street. And neither of those things are true. But the point is that if it's happening to our employees, who we know where they were leaving from, we know they were in vehicles, and we know that they weren't, there was no way that there was enough probable cause or reasonable suspicion to stop them, that it's for sure happening to a bunch of people that aren't law enforcement. And so, I mean, that that was kind of a canary in the coal mine kind of a thing that was an indicator of what was happening in our community, and, you know, was supported by complaints we were hearing from community members. And we all should be taking that seriously. And I also said in that press conference, I don't want to believe, and I still don't want to believe, that people, the real people of power in this country, whether it's the president, the vice president, whether it's senators or congresspeople, anybody's comfortable with people's civil rights being violated, and that's what that would be when those things happen. So, I mean, I think, and if that was part of why Tom Homan came here, that would make me happy. I know that when I had the opportunity to speak with him, he took things very, very seriously, and I thought he listened. So I was very happy with that.
And so you did have one-on-one or, you know, direct conversations with Tom Homan. Can you give us any more insight into what those conversations were like?
Yeah, I will say he came in. He seemed very authentic. I had heard from people that had met him before that he was much more street copy than you might expect him to be, given his career. That was my impression of him. As a police officer for over 30 years myself, I can kind of tell when people are lying to me. He did not come across that way. He seemed genuinely interested in trying to figure out what was going on, make things better, and to get to some solutions. He didn't give any yeah but kind of things. He sat and listened. He looked periodically to his staff and said, we need to track that, we need to implement that, we need to take that approach. I was very, very pleased with how the conversation went.
Did you ever ask or have an impression of why he wasn't here from the beginning and why he sort of came in later in the game?
I did not, although he's been very clear that he he said the president called him on a Monday morning and said, get down there. So I didn't get into that part of it. I was looking to do things to make sure that whatever we could get out of that meeting would be translated to immediate results out in the street and out in the community.
Some of the egregious illegal tactics that you and other law enforcement leaders have said have been happening here in the metro, had that been happening since the beginning, or was there a point at which where you started seeing it more and more? When did you start really getting concerned that this is a trend?
You know, I don't think that we saw it at the very beginning. I think it was a result of a bunch of people being brought in from other places that weren't familiar with the community. So I'll give you an example of one of the things that, you know, the way we tried to approach it, or at least I tried to approach things in St. Paul. I tried to keep lines of communication open with leadership here locally with the federal law enforcement. So one day, I was in my office, and myself and the assistant chief, and we got a notice that on Facebook Live, there were federal agents outside of the Mexican consulate on the east side. And I actually said this to Tom Holman. I said, you know, my knowledge of consulate law is what you see in the movies. I would just assume you can't, as a federal agent, go into a consulate, which turns out to be true, by the way, so you can learn a lot from movies. So I picked up the phone, and we called one of the supervisors and said, I don't know if you know this, but you have two people out in front of the consulate, and they're ICE agents, and we were watching the live feed, and you saw the phone ring, and one of the agents answered the phone, and they got in their car and they left. And so it was clearly a couple of people that were not familiar with the Twin Cities, didn't know that that's what they were standing in front of, and probably maybe didn't even know that if they knew what it was, that they weren't supposed to be there. But we were able to get a resolution to that without having there be a conflict of any kind. And, you know, we've been trying to do that the whole time, to educate and keep the lines of communication open so we can say, our community doesn't want this. And even if Washington tells you they can't tell you that, we'd say, well, all you're going to do is put yourself in conflict with local law enforcement. And if there's a way to do that a different way, we just appreciate that you would do that.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break, just a couple of minutes, and we're going to come back. And I want to ask you a little bit about how these last few months have been for you, more personally. And we'll do that, and then where we go from here. So we'll be right back. All right.
I can always say crime stats are
Welcome back to All Day Live. Yeah, we are having this conversation with Axel Henry, who's the chief of St. Paul PD. We've had this cadence of interviews, conversations with you now for quite some time. We appreciate you coming in and just everybody's kind of exhaling just a little bit, I think, right now. Cautiously optimistic as we are learning that Operation Metro Surge, according to the Trump administration's border czar Tom Homan, is winding down, coming to an end in the coming days, maybe early next week. I was curious, I want to use this part of our conversation to talk a little bit more about you personally and how you've navigated some of this. If you had to describe the last few months in a word or a couple of words, what comes to your mind?
Boy, this is one of those things when you talk about a topic like this that, again, when we see this, the polarization of different points is any word you pick is probably going to be scrutinized. But I would say personally, and it's not just for me, but for the staff and for our folks, is exhausting. I mean, it's just, the officers that work for us will put in 20 hours. They'll go and they'll stay in a scene. They'll work it to the ground. They'll work themselves to the bone. But the unknown factor, that constant thing sitting in the background, and the emotional toll that it's taken on our community. Again, our officers are members of the community, and they're wearing that with them, and that emotional exhaustion comes into play, especially when every day you're kind of waking up and waiting for the next shoe to drop, on this never-ending armed octopus or whatever. That just doesn't, it just keeps happening over and over again. We've been relatively out of the news, which is good for our city and good for our people. But I mean, Minneapolis is right across the river, and we're all one big community here in the Twin Cities. And so every time something happens, everyone's wondering, well, that's going to happen here, that's going to happen to us next. And that's a conversation we've been having with all the other chiefs about the fact that they've all been wearing this, even the ones that haven't had a single big news issue happen in their jurisdiction. Yeah. So it's just exhausting is probably the word I would pick.
Can I ask you, how did you feel when? A couple of questions here, based on things that were said. You just mentioned Minneapolis. I'm curious, how did you feel when you heard Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey look into the camera and tell ICE to get the F out?
I mean, obviously anybody has the right to say what they want to say. I think that Mayor Frey probably thought that was the right thing to say at the time that he said it. I can tell you that as a person that's been trying to work to get people to the table that are actually going to control whether or not ICE is here in the first place, I worried. I also worried that my conversations with people I know that work for the federal government was that the more the rhetoric would dial up, the more there was going to likelihood they were going to send more and more people in. It's the same concern I had when we saw a drug task force group did a search warrant earlier in the summer, and they were mistaken for ICE and they were attacked. And I kept saying, we have to make sure that we don't have that happen here, because the next iteration of this is going to be they're going to send in more troops to protect the ICE troops, and I don't want to see that get ratcheted up. And so, I mean, I was trying to, again, swim upstream to say, how do we solve these things to the point that we don't have to get to this issue? And so that's why I'm super happy that folks have gotten to the table and they're talking, and I think we're seeing the outcomes of that now. And I actually, people can doubt the sincerity of anybody that says anything nowadays, and I think depending on where you fall politically in this issue, you're going to do that. But I think it's important that all the groups have openly said that there was productive conversations in with those meetings, and if this surge is going to come to an end, my hope is that that's a learning lesson for us in the future.
My other how did you feel when question is when Senior Border Patrol official Greg Bavino, who really was the face of this federal operation for the first few months, said our operations are lawful, they're targeted, and they're focused on individuals who pose a serious threat to this community.
Well, again, I mean, I think when you make these all or nothing statements, that's just not a realistic thing to say. I mean, I have a police department right now that's authorized for 620 people, and we're short of that number. But to suggest that everything we do every day is perfect or exactly how you want it to happen, just isn't realistic from a human standpoint. And so the idea that you'd be going out and doing something with this kind of frequency and this kind of potential danger added to it, and uncontrolled parts, you're arresting people. That's a very complicated, hard thing to do. And some people don't want to get arrested, and they're going to fight back with you. The idea that that would go off perfectly and without any flaws just seems a little bit, a little bit inappropriate to say in those kinds of moments. So I don't know why any law enforcement, you would never hear me say that about my police department, and I think we have a great police department.
You said you met with Tom Homan, clearly. Did you ever meet with Greg Bavino?
I did not.
Okay. Is it your sense that President Trump or Congress people or whomever at that level really understood what was happening here on the ground, especially in those first few months, or was there a disconnect?
I think there was a disconnect, and I think a perfect example of this, just for your viewers or anybody else, and there's hundreds of these, is you hear this national conversation, and I think what happens is you work your way up to a big spot in Washington, D.C., but you started off somewhere, and your information or your experience is about the way it works in that state. So one of the things we heard on national news and we heard out of the national voices was that, and Tom Homan talks a lot about getting into the jails and having access to the people before they get released, was that the police departments and the jails need to let us, or the police department and the sheriff's departments need to let us into their jails. Well, in Minnesota, police departments don't have jails. But there are some states where that's true. And so I think what happens is they take their experience, whether they got that in California or Dallas or somewhere else, and they think that's how it works everywhere. And really, if you're going to do any kind of law enforcement operation, you should have an operations plan that really understands the environment in which that takes place, so that you realize that what may have worked for you in this jurisdiction won't work for you in another jurisdiction. And my hope is that that lesson gets learned and gets talked about, because things are completely different in other states. They have completely different rules. And we saw this with our communication with federal law enforcement around body cameras. When these first got out, they said, if you're going to work on our task force, we need proprietary control over your body cameras. And I was asked by the chief then to go and explain to them, we're never going to give that up, because if we have a problem here in the city of St. Paul or the state of Minnesota, we're not going to want to pull that footage back from you. We're going to have an expectation we release that footage to our public. And if you're saying we can't partner with you if we wear cameras, then we won't partner with you. And thankfully, over time, but the federal government has to make rules that apply to all 50 states, and every state has a different video rule. Some states it's to consent. I can't record you unless I'm telling you. So, and we're not like that here in Minnesota. So they have a very hard challenge in front of them from the federal standpoint to create rules that apply to all of the jurisdictions they operate in. But we have to work closely with them so they understand when you come into our jurisdiction, here's the rules in the state of Minnesota. Here's the rules, in the Twin Cities or for these departments. And you can't take your experience in Florida and bring it here and have it be effective seamlessly.
We have a couple minutes left. Obviously, this has been a very heavy conversation around Operation Metro Surge. Next time you come in, we're hoping we can get to the day-to-day of St. Paul PD, because while this has all been happening, every city, every community, every county has had to do its primary job, which is protect and serve their residents. Tell me a little bit about the things that you are working on now, the things that you are proud of. You would have gotten just some numbers here at the end of the year in 25. Where is St. Paul when it comes to serious crime?
Well, we're seeing big reductions in all the Part 1 crime categories. Probably one of the ones I'm most proud of is the work we're doing around non-fatal shootings. I was appointed as chief at the end of 2022. At the end of that year, our total was, I think, 193 people were hit with non-fatal gunfire, so a failed murder attempt. And those aren't self-inflicted injuries. We have those, but we parse those out. That number dropped down to 122 the following year. We were able to bring it down another big jump, and I think this last year in 2025, it's down to about 60. So, we're talking about massive jumps, and those is exactly what I'm talking about. That's 130 never happens.
Yeah, really quickly, I was going to ask, why is that important for you? Hear non-fatal shooting. Well, so why is that a big deal?
Well, because those contribute. First off, we don't want our people to get shot, but also. Those are the kind of things, those are the categories that if we push those down, the murder rate drops. And the murder rate, historically fluctuated between 13 and 17 up until about 2018, and then it shot up into the 30s, which for some jurisdictions would see this and think, oh, they'd be happy to have a 35 person murder rate. We don't like to end zone dance on our numbers because even if we got it to 1, there's someone's family member was killed. But last year we were able to drop that down to 15, and then that actually, it was raised up by 1 data point because we were able to get a recent case for a drug overdose charged as a murder 3 case. That means that I sold you drugs and you died from those drugs. We were able to hold me accountable for that. So that's an add-on to a status point, but it's taking that out of one bucket that was already a tragedy and just putting it into the other bucket.
Okay. What I want to just open it up to you here with just a final minute or 2 that we have left. What other message do you want to get out today, or what else do you want to say that maybe somebody hasn't asked you about in the last 3 months, or that's important to you?
Well, you know, there's a whole lot going on right now, and I think, you know, when I talk to community members, what I'm always quick to say is, you know, I love emotion, because you're not emotional about something unless you care about it. But we also don't make our best decisions when we're completely wrapped up in emotion. And so I'll talk to community groups and I'll say, you know, if you just spent the last 3 hours staring at the front door waiting for your child to come home, and they walk in and it wasn't, you're so thankful that they didn't get kidnapped or, you know, be injured in a car accident, and they're kind of flippant, you get very angry. And so you wouldn't make your punishment decision in that moment. You'd wait till the next day, whatever. And the same is true about positive things. Like you know, they tell you, walk off the car lot. Don't make a decision when you're all excited about buying that new car. And so I love emotion because it means you care. But I think we have a lot of emotion around a very emotional issue, and that's understandable. But that energy is being brought into environments. And one of the things that I don't think gets said at all by law enforcement is that, and we can look to things that have happened in Minneapolis, things that have happened in St. Paul, but they've happened all over the country and in many jurisdictions. When local law enforcement's being called into a scene where something has taken place, whether it's the shooting of a suspect that was protesting or whatever, or whether it's a shots fired deal in St. Paul, or whether it's any of those things, or a traffic accident like we had yesterday, if one of the concerns is that we want to make sure that if somebody made a mistake in that environment, the number one thing we want to do is to make sure we protect that crime scene so we can gather evidence and document those things. And sometimes right now, the behaviors of others, we're being called in to control the space, and then we're at conflict with our own residents. And I wish that they would understand, although I appreciate and respect and admire some of the emotion that goes into that, sometimes I think we're cutting off our nose to spite our face, because if you've got real concerns about the behavior of any law enforcement, and that's because, you know, we have more authority than other people do, but that means we have way more responsibility. And that's why that oversight piece is so important. That's why I think in Minneapolis, when we were hearing conversations about that they weren't going to investigate some of these things, everybody should be concerned about that, not the least of which should be law enforcement. Our power is vested in the community. They give us that power, whether you're a federal agent or whether you're a local police officer. And that only works if that oversight piece is there. And when we are at a scene like we were at this accident yesterday, we're trying to maintain that scene so we can gather up the evidence, because the oversight will be meaningless if there isn't anything to fall back on to say, here's the evidence of what happened in that case. And I think that's a part that I think we here in Minnesota are smart enough to figure out, that, again, we can hold those two tensions at once, and then we can be upset about what's happening and protest that and talk about that and have those conversations, but also not create a situation that we might regret down the road. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate you taking the time to come in, and look forward to hopefully some more conversations soon, and everybody hoping it quiets down.
Yeah, we had talked about sometime me coming in and plain clothes and bringing the dog, and hopefully the environment is such that wouldn't look like.
One of these times we're going to make that happen. You know, hopefully, you know, everybody stays safe here and things really calm down. But thank you again for coming in and just taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. All Day Live will continue right after this quick break.